Hey everybody, Matt Johnston here. We've been talking about in a series of videos about the interactive process determined by the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, as it applies to the Americans with Disabilities Act. As I stated many times, the ADA applies only to employers with 15 or more employees as a matter of statute, but I suggest that employers dealing with employees with concerns about returning to work with COVID-19 virus hanging out there, that they have a conversation modeled on the interactive process with those employees who have concerns. So the last time we talked about sort of the general outline of the interactive process, and one of the concerns that employers have to deal with when dealing with the interactive process is something called undue burden. So an undue burden is a burden placed upon the employer to provide an accommodation, but is not really able to do so due to it being too costly, due to it being too much of a change in the job functions, or too much of a change in how the business will operate. So I want to be very clear, although the interactive process is designed to come to a resolution about a particular job accommodation for somebody, it doesn't mean that the employer has to sacrifice their business on the altar of job accommodation. It is important to recognize that although an employer may be required under the ADA to provide an accommodation, they don't have to provide accommodations that create an undue burden. So what would an undue burden look like? Well, the first might be a demand for an accommodation that simply costs too much money relative to other outlays. So if you happen to be a small employer, let's say you have 17 employees, you have a business that is required for employees to be on their feet most of the day. All right, an accommodation of providing a wheelchair or a wheeled chair with multiple wheels on it and stuff like that, like an office chair, that could be too much of a burden on the employee's ability to perform the job. But if it's a desk space, a desk office, and the employee has a significant back problem where an ergonomic chair would be helpful, even though those ergonomic chairs are expensive, it would probably be viewed as a reasonable accommodation. Now, in the COVID world, the reasonable accommodation might be, I need to have an office by myself, okay? Or that's an accommodation that has been put up. Well, what if the employer doesn't have a designated office space segregated and with walls around the rest of the workspace? Well, the question is, could they build one? Perhaps. Oftentimes it's not super expensive to do so. But is that an expense that is outside the normal cost outlay for an employee, or rather for an employer? Building a separate office workspace might be acceptable and it might not. So these questions of undue burden are extraordinarily fact dependent. So it's looking at the accommodation in isolation first, is it possible? And then is it possible within the structure or the context in which the accommodation is being requested? So each employer has to walk through the process of looking at what is the cost. Cost should include both monetary outlay, it should also include physical changes to the business process. So is it possible to do this and still maintain our business in some semblance of operation? Does it require outlay in terms of in terms of physical outlay? Separate and apart from the cost, construction, implementation, purchasing of new equipment, those kinds of things are all part of what can be considered undue burden, and each accommodation needs to be assessed. Once you've accumulated this information and it's reasonably accumulated, you want to make sure this is documented in this whole process. So document, 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 so that when you go back to the employee, you can actually demonstrate, look, what you are requesting is not going to be possible for us. We can't change our business processes that radically to accommodate this. What about this option? Okay, so simply because the employee has requested accommodation does not mean the employer has to give the accommodation that's requested. It has to be a reasonable accommodation. It has to address the employee's need, okay, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the employee's preference, okay? So the employer has to find this balance between accommodation and fulfilling the need. Some accommodations are not going to be easily done. Now, I do want to put a word of caution in here. Many employees who have disabilities, they're aware of the cost of some accommodations, particularly if they've been a long-term employee in various different places, different companies. They have a pretty good idea what the cost is. So don't BS them in any way. Simply say, this is what we think the cost is going to be. Here's our supporting documentation. And the employee may come up with some fabulous ideas that are low cost but address their need. So be open to that process and don't dismiss something simply because it looks like on its surface to be an undue burden without any sort of change or accommodation, because you might find you can work it out. In our next video, and sort of the last one of this series, we're going to talk about some resources that you can use to talk about job accommodations. In the meantime, stay safe out there, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.